With us now is Steve Strauss, the Executive Director of the Empire State Passengers Association, a rail advocacy organization. Steve, thanks for being with us. The Adirondack is the last of Amtrak's routes. It still hasn't resumed service since the pandemic brought everything to a halt 2.5 years ago. What do you believe is the holdup with the Adirondack?
As ESPA understands it, there are three issues that are holding up the Adirondack. The first is negotiations with the owner of Montreal Central Station. It's recently been purchased by a real estate development company. And we just think there's some negotiations about rents and station use and things like that. There's also the longer term issue that the border and customs agencies have long talked about building a what's called a pre-clearance facility, where they would do all of the immigration and border activities at Montreal Station and then run southbound nonstop to the border. And I guess they would kind of do the similar thing. They would keep everybody on board when they got running northbound. When they got to Montreal, they'd do what they needed to do and then let everyone off the train. And those negotiations are ongoing as far as we know. The second issue is the condition of the track that the Canadian National Railroad owns. That's about 23 miles in Canada from Rouse's Point going north towards Montreal. Right now, the track conditions result in a maximum speed of 10 miles an hour. That's too slow for passenger trains. So Amtrak and Canadian National are in negotiations over how much Amtrak is going to pay for CN to improve the condition of the tracks, probably bring it up to a speed at least 40 miles an hour. And they have some existing contractual agreements. So Amtrak may be arguing that CN has some responsibilities that they haven't yet met. The important thing about the CN track too is that 18 of those 23 miles would be shared by the Vermonter. The state of Vermont and Amtrak and ESPA all are anxious to have the Vermonter extend back to Canada. And then the last item that we're hearing is that the customs and border or immigration folks are reluctant to go back to the pre-COVID activities or way of doing business at Rouse's Point. So we don't really know what all the issues are there. And that's something they're negotiating with Amtrak. We have heard that they're insisting that Amtrak pay for the transportation of any individual or groups that are taken off the train by either country's border enforcement folks. And so that's a cost Amtrak would have to absorb, although we don't believe that that's a particularly big cost because Amtrak does a pretty good job of checking the people out before they let them get on the trains.
So a number of issues, but is there one that seems to be the biggest sticking point?
You know, I don't really know. We're not sort of privy to that much information. I can tell you that a senior level Amtrak person told me that they were pretty confident they would get all of these issues resolved sometime in the fall, and that the train would resume. We're crossing our fingers and hoping so.
So Amtrak's telling your group it looks like the fall to resume service.
Yeah, it could be late fall, but they've said they're optimistic for fall. And then you should also know that both the New York senators, Gillibrand and Schumer, along with Congresswoman Stefanik in a separate letter, sent letters to Amtrak recently, fairly strongly worded letters, asking them to explain why the Adirondack had not resumed service. And Amtrak was supposed to have responded to those letters about a week ago. I haven't seen a copy of their answer, and I'm not sure they have answered yet.
Do those letters from the politicians carry much weight, or may it take the administration or federal DOT putting pressure on Canada?
It's not clear how much information Amtrak has shared with the elected officials about the fairly complicated negotiations that are going on in Canada. And it's also true that because these are issues in Canada, we have somewhat less influence. I suspect it's on the list of discussion items with the US and Canadian officials are talking. I'm not sure sort of where it is on the priority list. I wonder, maybe the better question is there something that US DOT could do to push the Canadian National Railroad along? I believe they have some trains that operate in the United States. So we have some degree of leverage. Also, in the big picture of things, the Adirondack is unfortunately somewhat of a small train carrying not so many people. So it does, it may not be first on Secretary Buttigieg's list at the Department of Transportation.
It is important to the North Country's economy. Many of those passengers riding the Adirondack are tourists.
One of the things that I would like to do as ESPA's executive director, once the train comes back, is work with folks in the North Country to improve the last mile connections to the Adirondack. So if people had a regular, minivan, nice minivan to connect, to be able to go from Port Kent or one of the stations up there, Westport, over to Lake Placid, that could be something that would increase ridership. I know, and you've probably covered the fact that there are big issues with trailhead parking capacity in the Adirondacks. So one of the ways to deal with that is to bring in some reliable shuttle bus connections that can take people from the train to Lake Placid, from Lake Placid to the trailheads and back. And that's a doable thing, and there's some federal money around to support some of those efforts. And this is a place where New York's tourism agencies, environmental conservation agencies, and state DOT need to learn to work together better to coordinate this. If you go across the lake to Vermont, you will see a state transportation agency that has a robust and well-coordinated bus connection network to their trains. And they market it and they make sure that it works well. And I think people are taking them. In fact, we have some ESPA members taking a bus from Albany to Burlington in a couple of weeks to ride on the first southbound train when the Ethan Allen is extended to Burlington.
And there doesn't appear to be any connection between Amtrak expanding the Ethan Allen Express in Vermont while the Adirondack remains on hold just across the lake?
Not really. I would say that Amtrak has had problems like the rest of the transportation industry in having enough employees. Unfortunately, at the beginning of COVID, they were forced to lay off some employees. Other employees who were in their late 50s or early 60s chose to retire. And now they find themselves in a position where they're short of train crews, and they've been short of the mechanical and maintenance folks to repair and keep trains in working condition. That problem is beginning to correct itself through a hiring program, but it takes some time, and they're still having trouble finding enough people. So it might tangentially, but I don't think that, I think if they can resolve the three issues we've talked about in Canada, the train will run again.
Steve Strauss, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you too.
ESPA is encouraging New York to compete for federal dollars to improve rail service across the state, including high-speed trains from Albany to Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo, adding more trains from New York City to Saratoga. And yes, they favor not only getting the Adirondack back up and running, but also expanding the Vermonter as well, from St. Albans to Montreal.